Good evening. I'd like to call the business meeting of the Portland Board of Public Education to order. It is Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020, and the Portland Board of Public Education is meeting at City Hall in Council Chambers. May I please ask the superintendent to call the roll?
Oh my God.
So loud.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Atkinson.
Here.
Mr. Balfons.
Here.
Ms. Bondo.
Présente.
Mr. Burke.
Present.
Ms. Figdor.
Here.
Ms. Morioni.
Here.
Ms. Thompson.
Here.
Ms. Trevorrow.
Here.
Ms. Brown. Mr. Casiel Reyes. Ms. Habib Zai. Mr. Parrott. Ms. Yangala.
Here.
And Chair Rodriguez.
Presente. Just real quick, Mr. Parrott did let me know that he would not be with us today. He had a conflict, and Mr. Reyes is running late. He missed the bus that would have gotten him here on time, so he'll be with us shortly. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For the report of the chair, we're going to use the time for Ms. Thompson to present to the board some takeaways from a trip that she took I guess it was in December that we were there. January, excuse me, in January. So Ms. Thompson, if you want to set us up, you have the floor.
So first and foremost, thank you very much for allowing me to present to all of you my mission trip to the Dominican Republic. We just went in January, mid-January, for a week. Before I start out, I just want to make sure for those present and watching at home that no taxpayer funds went towards this trip to pay for it, nor the school board budget. It was fully funded by Lifetouch, which is a photography company that does photos within various schools. And we have the representative from Lifetouch here this evening, Peter Olive. And so they fully funded my trip, as well as 49 other people from across the country and Canada to go on this mission trip. This gives you a little bit of information about the Lifetouch services. They've been doing these for about 20 years now, and they've had 17 week-long trips. They've gone to 8 different destinations, and to the Dominican Republic, this was their 3rd trip. As you can see, I'm not going to read it all to you guys, but over 100,000 volunteer hours, and you'll understand afterwards about the photography and the meaning that it had for a lot of these families. It's very moving, and I'm going to try not to cry, but Ms. Morioni will. In 2015, see if I can do this right. Okay. In 2015, Lifetouch leaders visited the rural community of Rio Grande, the Dominican Republic, for the first time. This small community nestled within the mountains was rich with sheer beauty, yet lacked hope for the children's future. A one-room school provided education for about 18 students. The rest of the children were faced with a difficult decision to walk 5 miles round trip for a half day of school, or, if they were old enough, to work to help support their family. Faced with this decision, most children did not attend school. Lifetouch's goal of coming alongside communities to support projects that support families in education. This location seemed like the perfect place for Lifetouch volunteers to continue their mission of giving back. And this is Sekani 2. They have a Sekani 1 that they built, and then this is Sekani 2. And there's a picture of all of the students and all of the volunteers. And here's my little friend, Giuliani, who I wanted to bring home with me. I called and let the girls know that their sister was coming home, but she already had a family. But one of the happiest, joyful children I've ever met. Just being around her just made you that much happier. So you'll see her throughout my presentation. There were a lot more kids there other than her. The 2016-2018 Memory Mission teams built a bright yellow 2-story schoolhouse and a cafeteria for the families of Rio Grande. Returning to the school for its dedication ceremony in October of 2018, they learned that 70 new families had moved into the community because of the school. That meant that even more children would have the opportunity to attend the Rio Grande school, but it also caused a problem. The school isn't big enough to accommodate that many students. Moved by the commitment of the community to try to educating their children, Lifetouch made the decision that the 2020 Lifetouch Memory Mission was going to be back, going to Rio Grande to add on to the school. As you will see here, we started from ground zero on building this addition onto the school. And the Sakani School project now boasts 2 campuses and educates close to 400 students from kindergarten to 6th grade. And the trip here was to build a school library, a computer lab, and an infirmary. And this new space means that school will now have space to provide education to all kids in the neighborhood. Some of us, so I didn't do a lot of cement work and brickwork, but I did a lot of painting, so I was pretty proud of my artwork here, because I am not an artiste, but that's the final product, and I did Grandpa there. So just to show you a little bit. And we painted the outside of the school as well as on the inside. A lot of upkeep for the school, so they were really thankful to have us there. This is just the neighborhood, the one on the right, the blue house, as well as the one at the bottom. The one at the top is a community that's called Villa Papi, and the government in the Dominican Republic uprooted the entire community. It took their land because they wanted to make it into a national park. So they displaced all of these families and made these wooden homes on the left, put them all in, people that had never met each other before. They lost their land, but now they're all coming together, and I have never met happier people that have little to nothing, and they will give you everything. It was very, very moving. So there's the whole group of us kind of being silly a couple times, and then the serious one at the bottom. But the people that I went with, I didn't know a soul going into this. I was really nervous. I am a social person, but still, when you're meeting 49 new people and going to a foreign country, and from day one, everybody just came together as if we knew each other for a long, long time. And I made a lot of great friendships, and I look forward to seeing more of them across the country. So there's Giuliani and her cousins up at the top, and then there she is again. And then as soon as the kids come out for recess, they just want to play and lie on you and do your hair and just anything and everything. They were so excited that people brought jump ropes and bubbles and balls, and they just were so excited to see us. The people in this picture here, the top left is he's on the board of directors for the National School Board Association, myself in the middle, and then the gentleman on the right is the president-elect for the National School Board Conference. And so when we go to that in Chicago in April, he will be the new president of the NSBA. And just for those watching and for those here, I was chosen when we've gone for the last 4 years to the National School Board across various locations, and I've applied every year to go on this mission trip. And finally, when we went to Philadelphia, myself, Ms. Morioni, Mr. Rodriguez, as well as some of the students, I applied again, and you watch the video and it makes you cry every time. But the last day of the conference, which was just a couple hours, we did not go to it. We took the students to the Eastern State Penitentiary, so I had no idea that I was chosen. They put my picture up on the, and I had no idea. So I got the phone call when I got back, and I was floored and so excited. And we did some zip lining one day, and there's my little friend. And so I'm going to put something out to the staff as well, and for all of you. The next trip that they're doing is January 27th of 2021 is to Guatemala. A little bit of information there about it, but if you want more information, Mr. Olive gave you some information about Lifetouch, who is also partnering. They're co-owned, or Shutterfly may own them now. I don't know if it's Shutterfly owns them. So I'm going to show you a brief video, and try not to cry and enjoy.
Hello, my name is Tom Burrow, Superintendent of Schools at the Byers School District in Colorado. AASA is proud to build hope in partnership with Lifetouch, our official photographer. The following video highlights the most recent memory mission. Truly a life-changing experience. A few years ago, in the village of Rio Grande, there was no education, there was no school. But because of the Sakani Foundation coming here to build a school, it has provided education to the children of this community. Many children have benefited from this. One in particular is Christopher. Christopher has enjoyed going to school. He has worked hard, and because of that, he was recognized as the #1 student in mathematics in 2nd grade for the entire country of the Dominican Republic.
What we all share on a mission like this is a love for bringing hope, for positive change, for making a difference, and building a school and having a place for the kids to reach their full potential.
So you come to a country where you don't know the language, and you do this work. You see the difference that it makes. It's been breathtaking. I don't even know how to put it into words.
When you look down into the valley and between these two beautiful mountains, you see a bright yellow school that symbolizes incredible hope. It symbolizes education. It symbolizes a community. I'm very proud to have been a part of this.
We all need hope. We all need to know that people care about us, that we're loved, and that's what makes a huge difference in the lives of individuals.
When we got together, it was just amazing on how quickly we became friends.
It's been amazing to see how many people have come together in this one common goal of helping build a better future for this community.
Laying the blocks and working on the work site, it was amazing the instant connection we all had with each other. We wouldn't know that this team just came together just a few days ago.
We've made a difference in what we built at that school, and it was an honor and a pleasure for me to be a part of this.
Picture Day was amazing. I had the opportunity to volunteer. Definitely didn't realize how difficult it is to be a photographer, but then had the opportunity to see students smile and feel proud.
It's been a really amazing experience for me. I'm glad that I was able to do it with new people that I just met, that I feel like they're like my family now. And I don't want to leave the kids and leave the people here as well, because they've been so nice and friendly to me.
What really got to me was taking the family photos. And these families, they've never had a picture taken before. To them, this is so important because it's going to help them remember their loved ones.
But I watched this older gentleman. He received the picture. He took the picture out. He looked at it, and he kissed the picture. That picture was 10 times more important to him than anything that we have at home.
This morning, 2 other individuals and I were standing out looking at the mountaintop across Costanza, and Mark made the comment, "What a beautiful sky." And I reminded him, it's the same sky that we have in Canada and in the United States. We're making a difference here under the same sky, but when we go home, we can make that same difference to the students that we serve.
I think what I'll take away from this trip the most is to just try to live in the moment, whether that's at school, as a leader, at home, as a mom, as a friend. And I think that that is what I will take with me forever.
I thought I was coming here to change these families and these kids' lives and to make a difference. I had no idea that these families and these kids were going to make a bigger impact on me. If I know that I impacted one life, even in the slightest, I know that my purpose of being here is finally accomplished.
So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present the trip. Again, I would encourage you, those of you that go on the National School Board Conference, but also you can go online to apply. And just to give you an idea, the school was 4 hours from the airport, so 2 hours to the base of the mountain, and then 2 hours into the middle of the mountain is where the school was. So, thank you again.
Excuse me. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Sorry, I need to get my stuff ready. I'll wait for Ms. Thompson to come back. Okay. So I honestly, I wasn't sure how to follow up. I didn't know if anyone wanted to ask Ms. Thompson any questions, or if we wanted to just move on to the next agenda item. Yeah, of course, Ms. Bondo, go for it.
Thank you for doing it. And I think just want to know how you reflect yourself after being there. And what I just want to make a comment is that this is something that we need to think about. I used to tell my children that we're taking too many things for granted here. And then when I look at our children, it's almost the same children who come here to the United States. Then we see our public school with the achievement gap. We really need some help. We really need us to see a different lens to invest on the education. Because when you look at those other countries, the education is so valuable. They really need it. And I hope you going there is bringing to us, I think as a whole board, we need really to think about now how we investing and how we making ourselves to represent those districts is not only one specific group of people, but the large majority of the students who really need our help, because you open up a different lens of thinking. Thank you for doing it. Yes.
Anyone else? So again, thank you for preparing. I know that you were anxious to share that with the board. So again, thank you for presenting with us today. Next on the agenda for the report of the students. First, we have we're up for a Portland Adult Education report. So Magali is doing her first report. You have the floor.
Thank you. I almost forgot. I'm going to do my report today for student report at PAE. Portland Adult Education is a good school that has opportunity for all continuous education for everyone, not only for immigrants coming from different parts of the world. We are all able and we can all pursue our happiness through education. Portland Adult Education has a reputation and popularity. It's known to those whose first language is not English, who are asylum seekers, refugees, and all immigrants in the city. As a new mayor, I want to welcome you to please understand that Portland Adult Education does have the responsibility for all adults who are willing to give a chance in continuous the education. I am one of an example and one of a typical student at Portland Adult Education. When I first came to get information and found out where to start to cover my education gaps, I thought that I was like already had enough English and knowledge to be able to move quickly through the programs. But after having conversation with teachers, advisors, and everyone involved in the program, college transition and high school diploma programs, I humble myself and open my mind and be able to be available to learn more. So as for today, I was informed that I passed my test and I was accepted at SMCC for the medical and community interpreter license. And the three values that PAE are commitment, community, and curiosity. I urge people to find out all the programs that PAE has to help all Mainers to continue their education. People with little or no English can take classes 2 times a week, 4 times a week, and attend lab for more intense educations. Anyone who cannot attend class at PAE can get information about other options in the city. Remember that PAE is the biggest school in the district. On January 29, PAE received the Collaboration Award from the Portland Region Chamber of Commerce. And one thing that I could like to share with you is the new program to evaluate student voice. Working with fellow student Ari Luvisi and faculty advisor Brianna Brizer and Anita Saint-Ange, we all be attending an upcoming conference in Baltimore from April 5th to April 8th. The program is the Student Ambassador Training Program to the National Coalition on Adult Basic Educations. One activity is to visit the Capitol Hill to teach our congressional delegation about adult education. Learning is a continuous journey. Please, let's not take continuous education for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yangala. Great job on your first report.
That's right.
Up next, for the report of the superintendent, Mr. Botana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Rodriguez. Congratulations, Magali. That was a great first report and excellent news as well.
Oh, thank you.
I would like to begin my comments today by recognizing the original inhabitants of the land on which our city and schools stand, the Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy tribes, known collectively as the Wabanaki, or people of the Dawnland. We're honored to have their children among our students in our schools today. This week, we begin interviews for the DHS high school position. I would like to thank Assistant Superintendent Aaron Townsend for putting together and leading this effort, and we are on course to have a recommendation to the board by April 7th. As indicated by the Maine Department of Education and the Maine CDC, we are taking steps to ensure that we do everything we can to keep our students and staff safe from the COVID-19 coronavirus. To that end, we issued a letter on Thursday explaining some common sense strategies for doing our part. Among the things that we're doing is, one, to encourage students and staff to stay home if they're sick. To that end, we've asked our schools to suspend or discontinue perfect attendance awards and other attendance-related recognitions. And we have asked our school leaders to establish expectations with families that students who are sick will be separated from their classmates until a family member can come and get them. We've also established additional cleaning protocols. Our custodians currently have a protocol for cleaning common touch points every other day with chemicals that prevent the germs from living for 48 hours. And in addition to that, we will be providing disposable wipes to allow classroom staff to wipe down things such as keyboards, toys, and other materials that are not normally touched during school cleaning. Our cafeteria and transportation department will also be implementing additional disinfecting routines. Finally, we'll be monitoring attendance patterns and communicating with public health officials on anything out of the ordinary, and we'll continue to coordinate with public health authorities. I'd like to recognize our nursing supervisor, Tina Villieu, school nurses, and our district physician, Dr. Patterson, for their leadership and vigilance in coordinating our response. And I would also like to thank our operations directors for their efforts to reduce the spread of germs. I would like to thank our HR team, as well as Moore Assistant Principal Jake Giesman and Data Manager Jamie Kearney for attending PPS's first recruiting event of the 2021 hiring season. The team traveled to a job fair at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, and this week, Justin Jensen, our HR coordinator, will travel along with Rohan Henry, a high school teacher at Portland High School, to the NenMet Minority Recruitment Fair, also in Boston. That's this Saturday, March 7th. I'm proud of the efforts of our HR director, Barb Stoddard, to improve our ability to attract the most talented and diverse people to our district. On a related note, our annual TNTP staff survey, which is an important part of our talent management work, is scheduled to launch later this month. And this important survey gives us annual information on how we're doing in our efforts to ensure that we support and retain the most talented and diverse Portland Public Schools people. Parent University's session on understanding the college application process, which was originally scheduled for January 16th, has been rescheduled for this Wednesday, March 4th. from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. at King Middle School. The session is led by none other than our Portland Public Schools counselors and is a must for anyone looking ahead to the complexities of the college application process. And for those of you who have younger children, it's never too early to start planning for it. I also wanted to invite members of the public to attend the Foundation for Portland Public Schools Spring for Teachers event on March 31st at Allagash Brewery. This annual fundraiser supports the Foundation's Teacher Grant Program, and it's always a super fun event. Last week, we hosted the Board's Public Affairs Committee's annual budget forum. The forum was well attended in person, but I was really floored by how many people were on Facebook Live. The recording of the session is available along with all of our other budget development materials on our FY21 budget development link on the front page of our website. I would also like to remind everyone that my budget presentation is scheduled for a week from today. This is a single topic special meeting of the school board. The District Building Advisory Committee met last Thursday evening. The committee developed a strategy for moving forward with the rebuilding of the 3 schools with a reduced scope to conform to the available budget. We will have a board workshop on this topic on March 17th, and in the interim, the building level advisory committees for Longfellow, Presumpscot, and Reike will be convened to begin to meet and help with the design specifics. I also want to note that there is a workshop scheduled on the first reading of the revised Memorandum of Understanding with the Portland Police Department tonight. This MOU is the result of our work with Chief Clark and his legal team as we work to address concerns that were raised back in December around the implementation of body-worn cameras by the school resource officers. The revised MOU is designed to address those concerns exclusively and not the larger concerns that were raised about the SRO program in general. The MOU does acknowledge and speaks to the fact that subsequent MOUs would incorporate any policy changes that deal with the way in which the school resource officers interact with staff and students and how PPS manage the use of school resource officers. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Superintendent. For the report of the Secretary, consideration and action to approve the minutes of the meeting of February 25th, 2020. Is there a motion? Ms. Thompson, second by Ms. Bondo. Are there any questions on the motion? Seeing none. Are there any public? Oh, actually, I had a question. On the old business for when we had the motion for book D. I know that we tabled a couple of them. I was trying to look for my notes. I feel like I wrote down there were 3 policies that we set aside, but I only see 2 of them noted here on the motion with the amendment.
So we were somewhat confused, and that's why we asked to table that. So there was policy DJ, and then policy DJH and DJR. I believe that we'll talk through that, but in essence, it's just 2 policies, DJ and DJH, which we will be covering today.
Okay, so it was 2 of them. Okay, good.
That was part of the confusion. We had the third policy, one of which is being collapsed in with the other one.
I see. Okay, so the minutes they do reflect that. Yes. Accurately. Excellent. I didn't have any other questions other than that. Is there any public comment on the motion? Seeing none, any board discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes of the meeting of February 25th, 2020, please indicate. And that's 8 board members. So Ms. Figler is abstaining because she was not here, and the students voting with the majority, with Ms. Brown also abstaining, she was not here. Next, consent items. Will the superintendent please read the list of donations made to the district?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Under Board Policy KCD, the school board accepts by unanimous consent contributions made to the school district. As required by that policy, all the donations are listed in the board agenda under this item. Our practice is for each donor to receive a written contribution acknowledgement expressing our heartfelt gratitude as well as for their tax purposes. I would like to thank the many generous contributors to the Portland Public Schools who have made donations of durable goods, goods of substantial value and historical or commemorative significance, and the beneficiaries and contributors for this meeting are Rowe Elementary School received a donation to use towards project-based learning work from Gail Cressy. And Casco Bay High School received a donation to use towards materials and supplies for their one-act play from Jennifer Tabb of Portland. And that's the report.
Thank you, Superintendent. Next up, we're up for a board focus on educational issues. These are two presentations with budget implications that we're going to have. First, a special education and LAU plan budget implications. Are you going to set us up, Superintendent? Yes. You have the floor.
Over the fall, we've been working with you to make visible key investments that are consistent with the Portland Promise. Tonight, we will be looking at the final, but definitely a key building block as we head into my proposed FY21 budget. Over the past couple of months, you reviewed and approved the LAU plan that we submitted to the Maine Department of Education. As you may recall, we discussed during that process that we would be coming back to you with the costs associated with implementing the plan. That is part of what we will be doing tonight. Also, Assistant Superintendent Malia Nally and her team have been doing intensive work this fall trying to evaluate our current special education staffing and develop transparent and predictable methodology by which to determine what is the appropriate staffing. That is also part of what we will be doing tonight. So, before we begin, I would like to bring your attention to the why of our focus on these two areas. I ask you to remember our recent presentation on our performance as a district. As you will recall, the stark gaps in performance between our students based on their economic circumstances are but a proxy for other opportunity gaps. They're a proxy because, by and large, our students of color, our students who are English language learners, and to a lesser degree our students who are disabled, tend to also be economically disadvantaged. So it's increasingly clear that if we're committed to breaking the cycle where students with special needs are relegated to a lifetime of economic disadvantage, we need to make sure that we address the opportunity gaps that they face. We like to think, as a country, as a city, as a school district, that education is the great equalizer, and it can be that. But we must remove the barriers to access to a quality of education that some of our students face. And that's what today is really all about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Malia Nally and her team to walk you through what they've done and what our needs are.
Great, thank you. I am going to tee this up, but the bulk of the presentation is going to be with Carlos Gomez, our Director of Language Development, who you know, and Deb Mullis, who's our Director of Student Support Services. And we're just going to kind of tag team back and forth here to give you all this update. So our goals for this conversation are that you have an understanding of the staffing needs and the costs associated with implementing the LAU plan. You all recall that we've had some conversations about where the LAU plan comes from, what's in our plan, and so tonight is to talk about how might we operationalize that in terms of staffing and associated costs. We also want to talk about our approach to special education staffing. We'll talk about this in more depth, but we've developed a weighted staffing model to look at our case management loads across our programs, and so this has been a tremendous amount of work over the past 6 months, and so we're excited to let you know what we learned and what the resulting recommendations are based on that analysis, and that's looking at those special education investment priorities. The superintendent just framed this up beautifully, so I won't really elaborate, but this is all about our equity goal and, you know, being vigilant about supporting every student's path to achieving high standards. And so this is really connected to our learning beliefs that all learners can rise to high expectations, and a recognition that students have different strengths, needs, and starting points. Therefore, they need different supports in different amount of time to get to the same high standards. So not that some students can get there and some can't, it's just students need different amount of support to get to that same goal. And that's a deeply held belief, and that's undergirding all of the recommendations that you're going to learn about this evening. In terms of where this is situated in the investment priorities that have the superintendent spoken about and were framed up at the budget meeting last week, as you may recall, he talked about continued investment in pre-K, both through opening up more seats and reducing barriers to access through transportation and before and after care. He's talked about being able to sustain and deepen our core instruction work. And then thirdly, he's talked about removing barriers to access, which is around the plan implementation, investing in special ed, and being able to retain that additional time for students who need it during summer school. So tonight, again, is just those first two. So Carlos is going to come up and talk about the Allow Plan, resituate you all in the data in terms of our student body, and then what we're proposing we do in order to fulfill both the moral and legal obligation of our Allow Plan.
Thank you, Malia. Just as a way to recall a presentation in late January, we went over and discussed a little bit the complexity of our English learners, the diversity in who they are, and just reminding everybody that this is a dynamic number that changes on a regular basis, and that as of the last few years, we've seen more asylum seekers compared to fewer refugees than we've seen in the past. In terms of the Allow Plan, some of the key shifts that we wanted to highlight, the fact that we need all of our teachers really to be teachers of language and meet the needs of our English language students, English language learners. We want to ensure that we are approaching this from an individualized programming rather than making students fit to our programming at the district level or school level. And also a mind shift in that language acquisition, language multilingualism is an asset and is something that we can build on and not to be seen as a barrier for students. So we have here a few key moves that we envision to meet the legal and moral obligations of the Allow Plan. And I will talk a little bit about each of these in the next few slides and sum up the projected costs that this would incur. In terms of collaboration and language instruction, we know that our students need direct language instruction, and we need to build the capacity of all of our general educators to be language teachers. We underwent a very rigid analysis, really, of who our English learners are at each school. We considered the complexity, including language proficiency of the students, how many are new arrivals, how many are kindergartners, maybe are either homeless and or dual identified special ed English learners, long-term else. So each of these populations have some differences. And in order to meet their needs, we are looking at an addition of up to 12 English language teachers to equip general educators with the curriculum and instructional strategies to support those learners. Also included in this is the second bullet point around endorsing, getting the ESOL endorsement, English for speakers of other languages, to people in our schools right now that have a wide and deep impact on core instruction. So those would be our literacy and math coaches and middle school strategists. So that's what we're looking at here. Yep.
I think we'll take most questions at the end as just a clarification.
Yeah, it's a quick clarification of why we're looking at these 4 elementary schools. Is this just a
giving you a
snippet
snapshot.
from the?
Yeah, I would.
Thank you.
The data is like a picture instead of students. It's showing you all that the spreadsheet's much longer, much wider. Multi-tapped.
Thanks. Another area that we are identifying is high school and middle school students who are students with limited or interrupted formal education, students that are anywhere between 3 and 5 years below grade level in their literacy. Some of them have never been in schools at all. So it's a wide effect or a wide range of of educational experiences, and in order to increase the capacity of our English learners and general staff to meet their needs, we are recommending the addition of an EL teacher specializing in reading instruction, as well as a language acquisition ed tech to support the, in several languages to support the learning, and half-time social worker to support the social emotional needs of our students. We discussed really the mindset and the mind shift in viewing heritage language and multilingualism. This is an area that I think will promote the idea of languages as an asset, as well as honoring students' identities and support in native language literacy, which we know transfers to English development. And the way we're proposing to do this is by having additional language acquisition ed techs to support the fastest growing languages, which right now are Portuguese and French. We have over 240 students who are dual identified, so these are students that are that have special education services and are English language learners. We are proposing a special educator who is EL endorsed, or an EL teacher who has a special education background, to help us meet the needs of emergent readers who are adolescents. This is somebody who would need to be well versed in various diagnostic and standardized assessments for languages. It's also we would need somebody who can help us create a system across several schools to meet the needs of not only students who are dual identified, but also the many students who are referred for response to intervention, of which currently I believe less than half of our students, English learners who are in the RTI process, are being identified for special education, which is much lower than the general population.
Carlos, I'm sorry, you said 240?
243, I believe, yes.
Okay, Carlos, can I just jump in and just to the point about, so of the students who are English language learners that get referred for special ed, Carlos is saying only half get identified, as compared to about 75 to 80% of our students who are non-English language learners end up identified with a disability. So what we're observing is that there's, people are not able to distinguish language from disability and are jumping to thinking, okay, needing help and unclear about how to distinguish that. So we're over-referring students with who are ELL into special education. Now, it's not that they're getting over-identified per se, because ultimately only half get identified, but just so you understand what we would expect versus what's happening and why we have a gap here.
So this chart attempts to summarize those moves, and I separated out on the fifth line the instructional coaches that would be ESOL certified. So I included that in the collaboration piece in the presentation, but this sort of quantifies what the ask would be for this to implement the LAU plan to its full iteration.
And I would just jump in and say that one of the questions I asked when Carlos started to lead the team through the revision and update to the LAU plan is, in what we're writing, what is the same, what's the same but we haven't been implementing it, and then what's an add. And there was a fair amount of stuff that was in the plan but we hadn't enacted and hadn't resourced. So for example, the proposed investment in collaboration and specialized instruction. We have always intended to do that and provide that. That's been in our plan. But what schools talk about is the need, what ends up happening is that they make choices about either providing what we should in terms of the specialized language instruction or prioritizing the capacity they have for collaboration and co-teaching, but they haven't been resourced with the staffing to do both, which is really what we should, I mean, that's what the research says, that's our best practice, and that's certainly what our plan calls for. So I just wanted to call out that these are ads, but they've been things we've desired and intended to do and have been in our plan, but we just have not resourced fully to this point. Great, so thank you.
Thank you.
And at the end, I'm sure you all will have questions and we can all pop up for that. So now we want to transition over to special education. So you all have had some conversations with us about the LAU plan and have some background context for that. So hopefully a lot of that felt pretty familiar. We have not talked about special education as much. So we have a little bit more explanation to do in terms of our process and sort of what's going to lead to some proposals that you'll see in a moment. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but that was a lot of information. Is there any way we can pause now for questions and then come back?
I'm comfortable with that. Is that?
Yeah.
Is everybody comfortable?
I think it's just a natural place to kind of pause for a moment.
Absolutely.
I know I had a couple of ones, but Ms.
Yeah,
Woodward-
and this next chunk is like a whole other set of things.
Yeah, so might as well
totally
kick it off
fine.
here. So if anybody has any questions about the first part that we just heard on the LAU plan, I have one really quick one, well, if everyone is getting ready. Just on that cost overview chart, the Secondary Life program, and I'm sorry if you included it elsewhere, I was trying to keep up. Where physically are we planning to house that?
That would be like a mobile team, if you will. We had attempted at one point to add in a middle school program that was housed at King.
Yep.
I mean, a challenge for us, and this is often the case for a district of our size, we have, big, large urban district needs on a smaller kind of district budget. So there's the how do we do this in our context. And what's tricky is obviously the population is fluid. So, we were maxed out at one point and then we weren't. And so we ended up deploying the resources for the needs that were coming up. But this is to acknowledge that reality and to look at the needs we have also at the high school level, and so to build the team that then can be kind of go around to the schools where there's the need. The other thing is, ideally, we are not having so many transitions for these students. So to the extent our teachers can go to the students rather than having them, in the case of the attempt at middle school, go to King and then transition back, that's better for them. Anything else you would say about that?
No, that's it.
The program in King, is it still there, like physically there, or is that one also?
So the first year that the program was in King, we had up to 12 students throughout the school year, 9 at any one particular time. The second year, for various reasons, we had only 2 students there. And what we were seeing was an increased need at the elementary school level. And when we moved, when Longfellow became a receiving school for new arrivals at the elementary level, there was an increased need and demand for those new arrivals at the elementary level. So we were able to meet the needs still that were coming to King and the new needs at Longfellow with that.
And I would just say on that point, so that was going to be an ad, and in that we did a redeployment. And then when you look at the collaboration specialized instruction, that kind of snapshot of a spreadsheet, we're looking back at that to make sure that we see how many people are where relative to the number of students, and that the ratios are appropriate for the language instruction that's needed for the size of the population.
And when you say redeployment, you mean like the staff that were at King then were moved over to?
Yeah, so we were going to have to add in order to enable the McKinney-Vento, for example, transition. And so what we just decided to do is let's redeploy that resource. So then, but when we look back, at the data, we're making sure that we're not and then adding on top of that, like these recommendations have that redeployment embedded within them.
I see. And just to clarify, the year that we're in right now, 2019, 2020, this is year 3 of our SLIFE program, right?
We have no, well,
So of that one, the original King one, this will be the third year that we have that.
This would have been the third year of that.
Yeah, I mean, in the new sort of kind of iteration of it, but yeah.
but we do not have
be
a
the right
secondary SLIFE program.
Right, yeah. So I know that's what we're asking for at this point, yeah. Excellent. And one last question, and then I'll let the other board members chime in. So we mentioned first year, you said we were in the teens, 12 or 13 kids. Then second year, you saw 2. How many in this year?
Most of them are at King already. I don't know the exact number, but I'd say around 7 at this point that probably would have been part of that new arrival center.
And we have high school during.
Right, and at the high school level, we have almost 100 students that are 3 to 5 years below their literacy, their grade level in literacy in their home language. And as I mentioned, several who have had no education experience.
Okay, so I'm during the budget process, as this becomes a bigger part, or as we have more opportunities to ask questions, I'm sure I'll want to learn more. This you know, clearly this is such a critical need, maybe not reflected in the amount of students that we're serving, but I guess the complexity of what we're trying to address and the needs of these children. Ms. Victor or Ms. Bondo? Ms. Bondo and then Ms. Victor.
Just have a clarification on the RTI and the special ed. And I see we have one teacher that we propose. I try to understand he's going to play a role as a coordinator or he's going to do rotate on different schools.
So
he just,
what would they be doing?
So this person would be assessing students in terms of their language proficiency in their home languages, as well as English. They would be able to create and advise schools on the implementation of response to intervention protocols and policies to account for language needs of the students. They also would help the multiple students in our special education district program, so functional life skills, functional academics, all the other students or the other programs that are listed here, to build schools' capacity as well as to advise on complex student needs.
So where exactly that teacher, that team of teachers will be? Right. That's what I want to know, because you have a different, the ratio of those students is all over the district, so where specifically they have to play?
So that teacher would serve all schools, so it would be centrally located to work with different schools.
So there,
yeah.
It's like a floating teacher.
It's going to be a floating teacher.
Yeah, deployed where the need is.
But we don't have the ratio of how many students in that category we do have. I heard about 240, I just need to make sure that, and then you mentioned about half of that.
So currently there are 243 special education students who are English learners, and do we know how many went through the RTI process? Or yeah.
How many went through RTI?
Yeah, or in the referral pipeline.
Oh, we could follow up on.
Yes, okay, because I just need to understand how one teacher can play that role with that multitude of children and have the right assessment to as a guide to make sure that we're applying. So maybe some question we come on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Can you take note of that? And just, I think you said this, but there's a systems building component of this, an assessment building process that's a big piece of that work as well. Yeah.
Ms. Victor?
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions. One is about the 4 language acquisition EdTechs. Can you explain where they would be located, how they would work, what that would look like?
Sure. So the language acquisition EdTechs would help develop the native language literacy of students help to acclimate students as they transition to an American school, and support English teachers and classroom teachers with this population. The ed techs would be predominantly Portuguese, French speaking. We would envision at our higher EL schools, so East End, Reiki, Riverton, Presumpscot, Ocean Avenue potentially, to serve the needs of the students there.
And I'll just add on to this that we made a structural shift last year with our ed techs toward having language acquisition ed techs that are kind of held centrally and deployed based on need. So in practice, there's certain ed techs that are going to spend their entire time at one school this year because that's where the need is. But in terms of how we go about that, rather than, our principal at Riverton thinking this is, my ed tech, it's more these are the pool of language acquisition ed techs, which we deploy flexibly based on our data and based on sort of the needs that come and go in the schools. And so sometimes some people spend their whole time at a school in a year, but we're monitoring the data and deploying people by the need.
So a single ed tech could spend time at multiple schools?
Yes.
Including at one time, not just over the course of a year? Okay, great. My second question is about PreK. I guess I had the understanding that we had can you talk about kind of what exists now and then where we're going? Because I had a sense that we had
invested.
Yeah, we had already made some of this investment, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah, so we added 1.5 last year. We had hired an amazing DL teacher and lost that person, so we do have an open seat, but we have the 1.5 in the investment. So the recommended add to PreK is a result of this analysis that we gave you a snapshot of, which is when we look at the required language instruction for students who are IELD and CALS, plus the need for collaboration, with a little consideration for the travel across schools and programs, that's where you come out with the recommendation for the add that is on top of the 1.5 that was included last year.
And can you remind us, with the 2 additional classrooms that we'll add this year, how many total pre-K classrooms we'll have?
There's 13.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
We currently have 11,
yeah.
and 2 more would be 13.
Yeah.
I should remember that, but thank you.
Should I could say them all and then add them on my hand.
So I think I have Ms. Morioni and then Mr. Balfans.
Thank you for all this hard work. It's a big amount of money, and so I guess I have a few questions around it. But I'm not saying that to say that we don't need it. I'm just saying I'm just kind of a deer in headlights for a moment of where it's going to come from, right? I mean, as you are too. So I guess so to clarify on the cost overview, these are all additional teachers needed, not any current teachers that will be shifting or
yeah, I mean,
transitioning.
Yes, these are ads. We are in that overview of the data. We're always looking at where the number is shifting and how do we reallocate, but what you're looking at would be on top of.
On top of. And then...
Can I just sort of underscore something there? There are reallocations involved in this as well. So there are some, schools that are losing, others that are gaining, and in addition to that, that's the request.
Okay. Okay, and then my next question was around heritage language. I just want to emphasize for the public as well, the Wabanaki studies is a state requirement that has no additional funding ever allocated for it. Is that still correct?
Correct.
And so when we say heritage language and these language teachers, is it involved in the Wabanaki studies requirement of the state still? In other words, I'm still concerned by the fact that it's a state mandated requirement, but we receive no additional funding. Is that still correct?
That's true, and that's different than this.
Okay, that's what I'm confused about. Okay, so heritage language
So
is not,
Wabanaki Studies would show up in our core instruction work, and the mandate, LD 291, is around instruction and providing Wabanaki Studies curriculum and instruction to students.
okay. And heritage language is the language spoken by the student of their native country.
Correct, and that by helping students retain that language, that helps them in acquiring English proficiency and literacy, and it preserves that, asset or strength our students have, which is obviously huge for them, and then the cultural identity component of it as well.
Okay, sorry, I was mixing it up, but are we asking for any additional funding under Wabanaki Studies in the budget this year?
That's not in our budget, no.
Okay.
I mean, that's what we'd
Okay,
love to, but
thank
it's
you.
not.
Sorry, I'm mixing.
It's not in the core instruction right now.
Okay.
But it's grant, the way we've done all of that work, just for transparency, is through grants.
Right.
So, and that's still the plan for this
Plan.
year.
Okay. And then under the 4 ed tech acquisitions, and I guess actually for all of these, how are we, do we feel like we have enough pool of applicants for these positions?
I was just talking to Human Resources and a couple of folks between the Teach Portland and the Language Academy at Portland Adult Ed. We're getting some good folks.
That's good to know.
And almost standardizing their experience so that when they do join us, that there is a common understanding about American schools, about some of the work that we're doing. So I'm encouraged.
Okay, that's good to know. And then actually that kind of leads me to my final one, which is, actually, no, I have one more before that. But that piece around the adult ed program, that was another question I had. How well are we doing with linking and ensuring that we are combining efforts, so if you will, for these types of positions, and looking at the deep knowledge of the adult ed students?
Definitely see Portland Adult Ed as a resource and a partner in this work.
Yeah, great. And then I guess my other question was around the RTI and the special ed numbers. When you said 248, but then you were also talking about you had a large pool that were misidentified.
Not referred, and then not ultimately identified to have a disability.
So is this RTI person the person that would be able to say, okay, this is someone that is a language barrier, or it's a person that needs special needs?
They would build both the systems and also support with the assessment process.
Because I think that sounds pretty critical in the sense that, I mean, not that all of this isn't critical, but that is of great concern, and the fact that students are designated under special needs, and they really shouldn't be there.
Right, and I mean, we'll look in a second in special ed at the percent of the population, and we're not, I mean, we have a slightly higher percent of students who are English language learners identified as with disabilities, but the data point here that's the sort of most concerning is that we're not that we end up identifying them, that so many students are referred with a concern from the staff that they have a disability and they don't, and so there's an issue there in terms of not understanding how to distinguish and meet the need.
Right, okay. And then my other thought was just around a lot of like areas that we may need to consider somewhat of almost like a pilot with some things. I mean, I know you're probably already thinking, okay, if we can't get 1.2 million for all this, what would our next sort of bracket of funding potentially be? And I appreciate you saying that we've always needed the first one, so I hate the fact that we continually, it's a constant need we have and we can't seem to get there, but hopefully we can work on that. But thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'll just say to that point, when the superintendent brings forward his budget next week, you'll see how the prioritization plays out in that recommendation. But we feel it's really critical that you all in the community understand what the LAU plan calls for. Again, we think of that as both a legal and a moral obligation, and what it would take to pull that off, so that as we're making choices, we're aware of what we're not doing that's within our plan.
Mr. Balfons?
So my question, I have two questions. The first question involves the levels. So we're looking at a total of 1,443 EL students. 844 of them are at levels 1 and 2, and then 599 of them are at levels 3 through 4.4. Can you explain what that means in a classroom?
Sure. So this is the levels refer to their English proficiency level based on WIDA and the Access exam. And so levels 1 and 2 are beginning levels. These are students who have almost no English currently. They may have a few words. They require intensive English language development. So this is an intense period of academic language, academic discourse to build sort of their knowledge of English to be able to access complex grade level standards. So we need to do both. We need to make sure that we deliver on that academic content and develop their language. So their needs are much more intense. The State Department of Education is saying that we need to give them at least 2 blocks of direct instruction per day. Levels 3 to 4.4 are approaching or bridging English proficiency, and these are students that are that need maybe only 1 block of academic language in English, so it's less intense, and many of the students are in general education classrooms accessing curriculum and need the support. Ideally, that their lead teacher in the classroom would have the skills to develop their English language, if that helps.
Just to follow up on that, with levels 1 and 2, are those students ever in, I guess, classrooms with everybody else?
Yeah.
But they're only speaking a word or two in English?
Phrase, getting to sentence level.
And that's part of where we deploy the language acquisition edtechs that help with translation.
And then second question, just changing topics, looking at the cost overview. Is this cost overview, is this at full staffing, or is this a good start?
This is on top of existing staffing, and this is what we're saying it would take to do. I mean, I will, for example, in the heritage language, there are 2 other strategies that were proposed that are not reflected, so there is some degree of prioritization already baked into this. In heritage language, we had proposed the language acquisition edtechs. We'd proposed keeping and expanding the before and after school program that was piloted at East End, and I think there was a 3rd piece of that. Those are not in here. We just went with what we thought was most high leverage, which were the language acquisition edtechs. Another example would be an interest in expanding the ESOL certification beyond just the literacy coaches. This is a start, what's reflected for you here. But the collaboration and specialized instruction, I think, are all-in costs, so that's not prioritized, that's to do it all. And that would be true for the secondary SLIFE program as well. Is that fair? Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I just have one quick follow-up question. First of all, just so that I make sure that I don't make assumptions. In advancing getting more of our staff ESOL credentialed, is that the kind of training for a teacher that could potentially limit or lower the number of referrals that are being made, because it gets the teacher a little bit more? Okay.
Yes.
So I guess the follow-up question to that is our staff aware of of those referrals and how many of them there are but really don't result in it? So I'm wondering if there's a level of awareness or an effort on our part to make our staff aware that they're over-referring.
Do you want to start and I'll add?
Sure. I would say that We need to build more understanding of that, and I think that the proposal of having a teacher dedicated to that work can help create that baseline knowledge for everybody. I think there are pockets of staff members that realize that that is the case, and others that don't.
Good, that's really helpful. I'm gonna, before we move on, and my sense is that this is the last question we'll have before we get to the special ed portion, but I want to add to the question I just asked. We see, and I brought this up often before, so it shouldn't be a surprise that I'm tying this in. When I look at our discipline data, we also see a disproportionate representation of our ELL students and special ed students in school and out of school suspensions. And I was also wondering, like I asked a moment ago, is our staff aware of those disparities? Because it's in creating awareness that these disparities are present, I'm hoping that there's a moment of pause of saying, oh, maybe we're not fully aware of how to best meet the needs of these children and the way that they're behaving in the classrooms. And that seems to me like a really important place to start in addressing those disparities.
I'll start and then do it. I mean, I think some are, but not all. And I would say that so we have district-wide equity PDs each year. And so this year, one of the professional developments for all staff is around discipline disparity. And part of the preparation for that at each building was to look at some of the data on those gaps. Not every building has done that yet. Not every building looked at the data. Not everybody walked away with the same conclusion and mindset. But there are definitely explicit efforts underway to start having that conversation in a more direct, data-based way. I don't know, Superintendent, if you want to add
just
to that
to add to that, and I think you also know this, and you've heard this from me when you've asked that question before, is that, this is the first year that we have, strong, reliable data that we've actually made public in the way that you've seen it. And so I think, we are beginning that process, absolutely. I don't think anybody in our team would think that it's not important for everybody to know those data and to be able to look at them and to reflect on, what we can each do individually, and then what does the school system need to do to break that cycle. And I think that's Malia's example is, part of what we're doing to make sure that every school has specific conversations about looking at those data and understanding, what those disparities look like. And I think that's very much the same with the referrals of students who are English language learners who we sometimes think might have a disability that, as we look at it, don't.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really appreciate that. And I should have started my comments by saying that through the Parent Advisory Committee, when we had the subcommittees report to us on discipline, that was one of the pieces that they said they were going to advance, to begin that work of rethinking our discipline philosophy and identifying those disparities so that we can have conversations in our buildings. So I'm incredibly proud that we are addressing that, and I like that this is tied to that same type of work. So again, Ms. Bondo, you have the floor.
I just get something about. I remember when we explained last time about the law plan, we talked about the long-term student. I mean, really stay. I just want to understand if they are reflecting on those numbers. If we are reflecting those long-term English learners, then which level are they? Are here, or they are different categories?
No, I think the collaboration piece would consider the needs of our long-term English learners, both in terms of the building and equipping classroom teachers to meet their needs, as well as some of the coaches and strategists that help develop teachers' core instruction with the English learners in mind. Part of that would be looking at who the English learners are in the classroom and delivering appropriate instructional strategies for those students.
And then I'm just showing this like partial snapshot, but they are included in the analysis when trying to understand the total population and the complexity of the population in doing the proposal for the collaboration numbers.
Thank you, Ms. Mondo. Ms. Victor, you have the floor.
Just so I have clarity following up on the earlier question, so the proposal here is that we would have a total of 6 EL pre-K teachers for 13 classrooms. It seems like, I totally get it if that's a need, but it seems like a much higher ratio than what we have elsewhere. Can you talk about that? And then second, is it possible to get to see the full spreadsheet that you use for the collaboration piece?
Probably. I don't think I would like to talk with the superintendent about it.
Okay.
It's a public document, but yeah.
Okay,
we can-
it just might be helpful to understand the numbers better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With regards to the first question, the student-to-teacher ratios are smaller at the pre-K level. I believe we're at a higher percentage of English learners at the pre-K level than K through 12, so I think that's part of the reason, as well as accounting for transportation time between sites.
Great. So I think we will move. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I just want to highlight one point around the last line you see here, endorsements, ESOL endorsement for, we're prioritizing coaches and strategists, but I've heard from several members of our language development team the value of having classroom teachers with that ESOL endorsement. New hires with that ESOL endorsement. I've heard in various conferences across the country that there are certain states that require all teachers coming on board to have that ESOL endorsement. I think that supporting new probationary teachers with that ESOL endorsement can have a deep and far-reaching effect, not only on our English learners, but the skills and the work that teachers do for that endorsement enhance academic language learning for all students. So these are techniques, it really just raises the playing field for all.
I've heard from some of our, a friend of mine who's an elementary school teacher at Rowe, she's ESOL credentialed, and she's talked to me about how that really just gave her a lens, and how it's really just, how it just made her a better teacher. Simple as that. Ms. Thompson?
I just have a clarifying question, and I know that Grace Valenzuela is in the audience, but I'm recalling, I wasn't here for the LAU plan presentation that you did while I was away, but I'm recalling something to the effect of that we had that back when we were doing professional development classes, that there was a requirement for them with something to do with the LAU plan and endorsement. And I thought that we were working towards that back many, many years ago, and I'm just curious if maybe that's not for ELL teachers.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're talking about classroom.
Right. I was trying to find the correlation. Thank you.
Here.
All right. Okay. All right, we're moving on to special ed.
Okay. All right. So Deb is going to tee us up, but like I mentioned, so this is newer information. She's going to just contextualize our student body in terms of our numbers and demographics. And then we're going to step you through what we've developed in terms of a new data-based weighted student formula, and then ultimately the result of that in terms of the recommendations we have for where we would need to invest to fully meet the needs of our students with disabilities.
Okay, so some of this information that I'm going to give you, we haven't really had an opportunity in special ed to address this board with just some basic information. So this first couple of 3-4 slides is going to do that, and then we'll go into the budget piece of this. So if you're not familiar, all the work we do in special education is driven by IDEA. And it really is grounded in providing individualized education plans for students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment, and that's what this little explanation is about. Our goal in our work in Portland Public Schools is right now we're at about what we call a 66% inclusion rate. That means 66% of our students are in what we call the least restrictive environment. So that means they're in the gen ed setting in regular classrooms 80% or more of their day. So that's a good number, but it's not good enough. And so our goal in special ed is to get that number up to 75%. So we've kind of looked at other districts in comparison, and that's a doable goal for us, but it's probably a multi-year goal. Just so you know, the 66% for us as a district is above the national benchmark of 63%. So what does our population look like today? Every year on October 1st we do a child count, so that's where we get most of our special ed information. We have 1,078 students in our district identified for special education. Just so you know, we're a city that has a lot of private schools. So 34 of those students are not students that are within our public schools, and they may or may not be Portland residents. They're just students that we're responsible for in special education because they're in a private school within Portland. So that's the 34 students at the bottom. The students that we would focus on are those 1,044 who are within our schools. So those 1,044 students, about 2/3 of them are in regular ed placement. And then about 21% are in what we call a resource room placement, which means that they spend about 40 to 60% of their day in the regular ed setting in comparison to the students I just gave you a few seconds ago. And then about 13% of our students are in self-contained placement, and that means that they spend less than 40% of their day in regular education. And for many of those students, because we have some fairly robust life skills programs and special district programs, I would say, you know, they're spending the majority of their day in a special education setting. So from our data, about a little less than 16% of our students, 15.8% of our students are identified for special education. When we compare that to the state average, we're a little bit below the state average. And as a nation, just so you have this benchmark, the nation is somewhere between 13 and 14% for identification for special education. The feds are always about a couple of years behind us, so it's a little squishy when you look at that data to kind of compare. So our data there is just from this past October 1st. 23% of our students with disabilities are English learners. That is very much in line with the percentage of English learners in our district. It's about 23.7%. And then our percentage of male and female is there as well. That is in line with federal data. We identify way more males in special education than we do females, but I would say for our district, we're a little bit over on our identification of males in special education. And as a district, we are basically proportionate in our identification for students with disabilities based on race. So so this kind of leads us into our work this year. So our work this year was really to look at how can we develop a staffing model that supports our work and our decision-making process in special education. And when we did that, we really started looking at the roles in special education. So this is just basically who are the professionals that are doing the work on the ground in our buildings. So we have resource room teachers, and that's their charge. And then we have self-contained teachers, and then we have a whole bunch of specialists like occupational therapists and speech therapists and psychologists and PTs. And those are the people that make up the bulk of our work. And then we have, a fair number of educational technicians, paraprofessionals who we employ to do our work in special ed. So what we did was, if you were here on this board in 2010, 2010, you might remember that we had a cost benefit done for special education by an outside agency. And one of those recommendations from that staffing analysis and cost benefit analysis work that was done was to develop a staffing analysis for our district. That's what we worked on this year. So that's what we're going to present, some of the information from that and kind of how it led us to our budget work this year. So we focused on the resource room as the bulk of our work to start, because most of our students, like I just showed you, are in a resource room setting. So we did look at several school districts or states when we looked at how we were going to fashion this. We looked at the Madison School District, we looked at the state of Florida, and then we looked at a district in Texas. And they were all a little bit different in how they organized their work, and none of it was really an exact fit for us. So we kind of took a little bit of Madison and a little bit of Texas, and then considered some of the other. So it's a little bit of a mashup when we thought about how a staffing analysis model would work for Portland.
Can I jump in, Debbie?
Yes.
Add. So, and just to step back just a little bit on this. So the way we've done staffing is to take basically straight ratios, 20:1 at elementary, 25 to 1 at middle, and to apply it that way. And we have not had a consistent, predictable data system where we're able to look at where are we tracking against the students, because this is the number of students that is fairly fluid. And so when Deb's talking about the fact that these are 3 of the districts or states, we looked at many, and these were some of the ones that we honed in on. What we were trying to accomplish was a more nuanced model for how you think about staffing. And so you see things called out there in terms of looking at things like workload analysis, looking at disability categories. So a lot of districts and states have more nuance in their numbers. So if you're a case manager and you have 20 students, and all 20 of your students have behavior plans or autism, that's a very different 20 students than if your 20 students have speech therapy. I don't know, just giving an example. And so when we hear from our schools, our teachers and our administrators that they feel overwhelmed and like there's not, that they're not staffed appropriately, we were using a fairly blunt way of considering that, 20:1. You're in the ratio, you're not. So what we are trying to do here is really think in a more nuanced way about the reality of the work of a special educator in order to build an algorithm that considers that in making the recommendation for how we should staff across our schools.
Yeah.
So here's what we landed on.
So when we did think about how we were going to organize a staffing analysis, we considered things like the category of disability and how much specially designed instruction does a child get, whether they had dual identification, ELL. We looked at the workload of a special educator and figured out that it was about 1/3 of their work week was actually spent just in case management. That means writing IEPs and doing, progress monitoring and all the other kind of paperwork things that belong to special educators. Then we considered other factors like, does a child have a behavior plan? Do they have one-to-one ed tech support? And what other district program guidelines might we have for our life skills classrooms or, our breathe classrooms, because those are already set. And then we had some state caseload guidelines that we've always had in our state regulations for special education. Those have always seemed incredibly high for the amount of work that are on the backs of our special educators and our specialists. So we look at those and they guide our work, but certainly it's just one indicator.
Great. So the results, so this is like the last example. This is not intended to be data for you to look at. This is just giving you a portion of a snapshot of a extremely large spreadsheet. But we're giving you a little glimpse into it to help you understand how this kind of played out. So what we did is we assigned a particular weight for each disability category so we would look at, for example, the top school East End. They have 40 students, and then way further over on the spreadsheet, we've got a proportional weight based on the disability category and how much work that typically takes. That gets applied. In addition to that, we applied a weight for students who are dually identified, and so you're not supposed to see the numbers here. You're supposed to just understand conceptually how we went about this. So in East End's case, while they have 40 students in the building, the total weighted student number is 45.13. So that it feels more like having a caseload of 45 students when you apply the weights across the disability categories that include the dual identification consideration. In addition, what you see here is information like Deb mentioned from the previous slide, which is the number of SDI hours, specially design instruction, and what else do we have here? And how much that is by average by student, just to give us a gauge. Those don't factor into the algorithm. Those are just things we're looking at as we're making ultimately judgment calls about our recommendation based on what the algorithm would suggest we would have in each building. So then we looked at that relative to the existing ratios we use, and then we lowered them a little bit given how much feedback we've been getting around the challenge from our case managers and resource room teachers, and compared that to the existing staffing in the building, which gave us a potential range of adjustment, and then the recommendation is kind of where we came out. Further to the right on the spreadsheet, we also have data and information about ed techs, one-on-one ed techs, and behavioral health professionals. So we looked at that whole picture and trying to make thoughtful recommendations about staffing where we were, obviously mindful of using our resources efficiently. And so in a moment, we'll look at the net recommendation from this as one of the places that our recommendations come out. But what's interesting is, I will say I was expecting us to come forward with a recommendation for quite a few ads, and it nets out at a recommendation to add just 0.5. So that you'll see in a minute when we sum up where we're at. It does, however, include some adjustments. And so there's some places that are losing, some places that are gaining. And that's really part of the big idea here, is that we manage resources around special education centrally because of the moving numbers. And we need this kind of a system and predictable data so that when new needs come in, we're not just thinking we have to add, but we're really looking critically at our data and where we might have room to make adjustments versus where there's a need for adds. And the one other thing I would say here is we did make an assumption of in our buildings having at least 2 special educators. And so that was sort of a minimum threshold, and the reason for that connects back to the goal that Deb shared, which is that we're trying to move toward a more inclusion model which leans on and requires collaboration. So if you think about a school, that gives you 2 teachers to do collaboration with all the teachers in the building. So that was kind of this minimum threshold that we use in coming out with a net recommendation. Okay. And then we also did this for the district programs. So these don't have the same kind of weights or kind of as much nuance to the consideration. These are more about guidelines related to caseloads given the type of program. So, a beach program that serves students with autism spectrum disorder, we already have some pretty straightforward ratios. And so we just looked through all of our programs at what they have the capacity for, how many students are currently there, how many we're projecting for next year. And so we did that for every single district program, as well as for all of our district specialists, like our occupational therapists, psychologists, etc. So this is just to help you understand conceptually how we went about this. And all of that resulted in a set of investments that Deb's going to step you through. They fall into 3 categories of completing our behavioral health continuum, the work we launched last year but didn't quite finish. ensuring we have a continuum of supports and services for students with autism spectrum disorder up through middle and high school. Right now, we just have our beach program in elementary. And then the third piece is around addressing caseloads in targeted areas, and that's what's come out of that analysis that we just talked you through. So Deb will walk you through each of those, and then we'll sum it up with a cost slide like we did with the LAO plan in just a moment.
Okay, so our first area is completing our behavioral health continuum. There were two things that we did not, one that was a budget cut last year, and then one was something that we didn't add last year. So the first is considering the Breathe classroom for Deering High School. That was on our budget last year, and then we opted to just fund one of those and do a phase-in model. So we did the budget for the Portland High School classroom, but not for the Deering classroom. So that's an ask of an ed tech and a half-time social worker. The teacher's already in that classroom. It's already in place at Deering High School. So those additional asks are just for those things that are needed to bring that classroom up to what we would call a day treatment level of service. The second ask for the behavioral health continuum is to have a BCBA that would support half-time in the Breathe classroom continuum, and then also support half-time with district-wide efforts. We've had to contract out for those services this year probably at an expense of that would have been larger than employing a BCBA. To be quite frank, it's not a cheap contracted service, so that's an ask there.
And sorry, Deb, I'm just going to, two quick clarifications. One, Deb mentioned with Deering, it would bring it up to a day treatment level of service. I think this is the in-school, not the day treatment. So we have day treatment at Portland High plus the in-school program. You know, we talked about the continuum. So this is for the model for in-school program, so I just wanted to clarify that. And then I just wanted to make the connection to Member Rodriguez's comment earlier about discipline disparity, and just identify that this BCBA is helping work with teachers on behavior plans and making recommendations. So we see a connection there to exactly what you were talking about and to the duly identified position that Carlos was talking about a minute ago.
Excuse me, can you just say for the viewing public as well as for us, BCBA stands for?
It's a board certified behavior analyst. Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. We use so many acronyms in special ed.
Yeah.
It just flows off the tongue. Okay, so our next ask is to extend services for students with autism spectrum disorder, which is ASD, to our secondary level, which is middle and high school. So we've had the Beach program at elementary school for 7 years, very successful program. We actually expanded last year into a second elementary classroom because of the need at the elementary level. But what we haven't done is expanded that same continuum at middle school and high school level. So this is, the ask here is for each of these classrooms. There would be one at middle school and one at high school, and they would be staffed with a teacher and 3 ed techs each. Right now, just to be perfectly frank, the priority is at the high school. That's where the big need is, but to build that full continuum, the middle school classroom is needed as well.
And I would just add on to the high school point that we are using some of our day treatment resources from Portland High School for this ASD high school classroom. We have many middle school students in day treatment coming up to high school next year, so we cannot redeploy the resource that way. And so we will have these students in this classroom that don't have the resources, the teacher and ed tech to serve them. So.
And our last area is just to address our caseloads in some targeted areas. And there are 5 or 6 areas on these 3 slides coming up. The first one being occupational therapy. We really do have a need to have another occupational therapist based on our staffing, our workload analysis. I'm not sure if everybody here heard from our OTs a week or so ago, but they presented and talked about their workload and their caseload analysis and gave you some information on that. And our staffing analysis work supported that as well. Our next need is in the area of school psychology. When we compare the work of our school psychologists against national norms, the national caseload is at a ratio of about 700 students to 1. That means 700 school students, public school students. Our current caseload for our psychologist is 1,223 to 1. So it's an enormous difference. I want you to be careful of those numbers because certainly we have some other supports in our schools that go beyond school psychology, like social work and school counselors and other supports. So different school districts and different states set up school psychologists quite differently. We use ours mostly for consultation with schools and special ed teams, and then for evaluation for special education. And that is pretty typical in Maine. Another area is .5 resource teacher. That was the result of the staffing analysis to make sure that we had at least 2 special educators at every school. Our special ed coordinator is a position that supports special educators with consultation, with help finishing their paperwork, with some expertise in the areas of special education, and also they provide guidance and support to building administrators. So they act as what we call the local education administration representative. So they're a decision maker at our students' IEP meetings, and they can be an incredible asset to have to help our building principals. Right now we have 3 of those. We really do need to have 4. Our surrounding districts are at a 92 to 1. That's 92 special education students per 1 support person like this. It's a teaching position. Our average right now is 269 to 1. So just a little comparison there. This would bring us back to our original funding, our original staffing of the 4 coordinators we had in years past. The next 2 lines are ed techs. We need 2 more ed techs in our beach program. Next year we will be at capacity at our elementary program. That program is set for 16 to 1. We will definitely be there. We already know how many incoming kindergartners we have being considered for our beach program, so this is a real need to have 2 more ed techs in that program. And likewise with our life skills classroom at Deering. We have 2 positions that are less than full-time, so this would be bringing those 2 positions up to full-time, which is the .4, and then the ask for an additional support person just for that Deering Life Skills classroom. So here is our bottom line detail. It actually, it totals up to $963,000, which is a big ask. The areas are broken down there into those 3 areas of the behavioral health continuum, and then the ASD classrooms for autism for middle school and high school, and then right-sizing some of those positions where we just have an incredible need to have some additional bandwidth. I believe that might be. That's it.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, Deb, you were going to just briefly speak to. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, thanks, Malia. So just so you know, and I know you're aware of this, but we in special education do have the ability to get some reimbursement for medically necessary services that we provide within the public school setting. We have estimated with Miranda Fasulo about 1.6 million, I think, it's 1.67 million for possible revenue/Maine Care Medicaid reimbursement for those medically necessary services. So that doesn't actually come off of special education. It ends up in the general fund somewhere, but it certainly is something to think about when we think about what we're expending and what we possibly could be thinking about, bringing in to support our work.
Yep, and then one other final point, just related to cost and revenue, is that we also have an obligation to meet the needs of our students per their IEP. So, for example, something like Beach or the high school class for students with autism spectrum disorder, there are cases where if we aren't able to provide the service, there's still a cost to us because we'll have to send students out of district. I think in the Beach case, like at some of the schools, not only do we have to reimburse for the school, the transportation, but also actually pay for a one-on-one to be at the private schools. So that's just a factor that we have to consider when we're looking at the needs in special education as well.
Sorry, it's a lot.
No, and expected. Let's go, Ms. Thompson, Ms. Morioni, Mr. Barrett.
I just have a
Big
question.
door.
Deb, I'm not sure if you were our Assistant Director of Special Ed at the time, but I'm just, and I can probably find the information, but didn't we used to have, I'm not sure if the title was correct, Special Ed Secretaries? And then we cut them all, from what I remember, which increased the workload. And I remember there was a lot of feedback that for them to allow services to the students was reduced because now they were all doing increased workload. So it's almost, it's sounding like we're going back to kind of what we had to lighten the workload. But I'm wondering, I'd have to look back at the data that we had back then, but I know that report was very controversial. So I'm not sure what parts of it you gleaned that were really, likable.
Yeah.
Because it was a very interesting presentation at the time.
Yeah, so we do have, I think we're appropriately staffed secretary-wise for special education. Our secretaries are beyond a typical secretary. They really are specialists in the field of special education. But right now, they're reviewing special ed paperwork, and it really should be overseen by someone who has a degree in special education.
But didn't we have them at each of the schools, or somewhat more? They weren't strategists. They did
Learning strategists or secretaries?
No, I can go back and look. But they took a lot of the workload off so that our special ed teachers could actually do special ed and work on the IEPs, and then we took that all away.
Yes, those were positions that were cut in 2008 or 2009. We reduced by a half. I was actually one of those staff. We were learning strategists, and we were a teacher leader within each building. So when that got cut, then we did multiple buildings, and then that number, I think, went from 8 down to the 4 that we ended up with.
So you were doing the workload of the casework, the paperwork, and then that paperwork fell on them to do because you no longer existed.
Right.
I was just trying to figure out the staffing
Can you
ratio.
talk a little bit about how many special education secretaries we do have? And then also, when you talked about that 92-to-1 ratio in surrounding districts, in most districts, that's what we just discussed, right? Those are strategists that are assigned to buildings. They're not central office,
That's right.
Teachers on release. They're actually embedded in the building. So can you talk a little bit about that, just to clarify?
So, yeah, to Javier's point of the 92-to-1, I mean, these are districts with much, much smaller numbers than we have, and many, many fewer schools than what we have. So our rub is that we have a lot of schools, and we have schools that are highly enrolled. So our numbers in special education, the nearest district to us is about 2/3 our size. There really is not very many, there are no districts that compare to us in terms of size for special education. So when you think about those supports, it's a little easier for some other districts to have a person in the building that would be solely, responsible for supporting special education.
Let me jump in
Yeah.
and bring you back to the secretary question, but I do think, and what I hear, obviously I wasn't here 10 years ago, but I definitely hear about the learning strategist, that we used to have one in the buildings, and then there was the reduction to the 8, the reduction to the 4, the reduction to the 2, the building back to the 3, and here we're proposing a building back to the 4, but that's a little bit what's happening, because I think, when we ran the case manager ratios, like I said, I was expecting them to come out with a net recommendation of a lot of add, and it's just the 0.5. But this is the place where I hear from Deb and others that people feel we have a need that we haven't invested in as much as people would need. But can you speak to the secretary question?
Yeah, so one of the things we did do when we did lose the coordinator or learning strategist position was we did increase our special ed secretaries. So they're highly skilled, they're highly trained, and they do a fair amount of the work in paperwork that special educators are responsible for. They approve things, they look over things, they look in terms of the law and if things are aligned with our obligations. And they're really a very good oversight, and definitely more than, a typical person, doing secretarial work would do.
So do you think that with these changes, with the staffing ratios, et cetera, it will further reduce the paperwork that the special ed teachers who need to be working with the students on the IEPs, do you feel as though it's going to further reduce the amount of paper that they push?
Absolutely. I think it'll serve two purposes. It'll help to reduce that for sure, and then it will also increase the level of I don't want to say not really compliance, but the level of work that's being done at the school. So I think it's going to be some oversight that we haven't had in place to adequately staff this level of work. It's a lot, yeah.
Ms. Marioni next. Go for it.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is around the behavioral health continuum around for autism students. What are we doing now for middle and high school for these students? How are we currently serving them?
Yeah, so we do have some students actually out of district that we're not able to serve because we don't have these classrooms in place, so that's a reality. And then a lot of times we're putting a one-on-one support with a student so that they can have, so that they can be in school, and they don't always have that. They need a level of therapeutic service that would be provided through this autism classroom. It really is quite different when you have the students in a consistent learning program for students with autism and how you support those students in accessing all classes.
And then I just would add that, I mentioned the high school. So when we were at Bayside, since we have not had a classroom for these students in high school, many of them ended up at Bayside. That is not, from our director's recommendation, you're putting students with emotional disturbance and behavioral disabilities together with students with autism spectrum disorder. It was really not a great fit in terms of how those students interacted and it's not a great model. So that was a big need, was to sort of separate that. So it was the case that our day treatment level of service for high school this year, there weren't as many kids with that. And so that's why we retained this program for students with ASD. But then that's our issue, is that we have a big group of middle school kids coming up that need our more traditional day treatment for students with emotional and behavioral disabilities. But we still have these kids that are in this ASD program that we otherwise don't have program for.
And what's the total number of students?
With ASD? Or
Yeah, just in the whole, all elementary, middle, high school.
Identified with ASD.
Yeah.
We might have to follow up.
Okay, that's fine.
I can tell you the total number of students that we have with autism in our district. Actually, this is too funny. We have actually, out of our 1,077 students, 161 of them are students with autism, about 15% of our students. Now, not all those students it's a spectrum, so not all those students need a district program. But right now, for next year, we'll be fully enrolled at the Beach program at elementary level with 16 students, 2 classrooms of 8, and then the middle and the high school classrooms are designed for up to 13 students.
I'm sorry, that was 161 out of the 1,044?
Yes.
Which is the 15%?
Yep.
Okay.
And then one final question. When you talk about the continuum, middle to high, are you specifically saying, like, which high school, which middle schools? Have you determined which ones?
We haven't, although the ASD classroom as it is right now, that we're using the Breathe classroom, is at Portland High, so we would definitely not want to move those students. They've been there all year, so we're anticipating that that high school classroom would remain at Portland High.
Thank you.
I forgot, I'm sorry, who was next? Mr. Burke, and then Ms. Bondo, and then Ms. Victor, I'm sorry, and then Ms. Bondo, down the line.
Yeah, thanks for this presentation. With all the pressures that I've heard anecdotally from parents and teachers and administrators, I've never heard about the psychologist being one, and hearing you say this is where our ratios are, which seems alarming, but then you say, well, don't forget that there's other context to that. Can you tell me what is the lived pressure of not having that additional psychologist?
Yeah, I can. So I can give you probably a better context. So typically, a psychologist will complete around 75 to 90 evals a year. So these are evaluations for students who are already identified. Every 3 years, we have to do what they call a reevaluation. But then it's also a new referral. And every single new referral will take about 15 to 17 hours to do per individual student. So that's a big lift when you think about the number of evaluations. So when I met with the psychologists about, probably a month or 6 weeks ago, many of them were almost at 70. So that's a lot. And, you know, they're already almost at their capacity for the year. And certainly they're not all there. But that was when I started to look at, and then there was an ask from Javier to really look at, you know, what is our psychologist load? And it really is kind of out of whack with what we need. We really do need the capacity to have some more staff.
And to bring this into the conversation we just had about the number of referrals that are going into special education that are then not identified, conceivably, if we made investments into the LAU plan, does that mean we would not have so many assessments that are being done that take 15 to 17 hours per case? And
that is correct. There would be an assumption if we got that into better stead, that we would have fewer referrals and less. Just so you know, though, the numbers, so we had 61 of our initial 67 of our referrals last year were ELL referrals for students identified as English learners, and out of that, 31 students were identified. So we're really talking about, 35 referrals that possibly could have been avoided, and a little bit less when you think about an error, a margin of error of maybe not every referral is going to result in identification.
Yeah, and just to make sure I understand process, all those 60-some-odd students still had the assessment done by a psychologist. True?
Yes, a part done by a special educator and maybe done by speech therapist and OT and, depending on the needs of the particular student.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Ms. Victor?
Just to follow up on that, are the school psychologists doing the evaluation, doing work beyond the evaluations? Like they're also meeting with students? Because I'm trying to understand your statement about the other supports that we have, and how that impacts, in addition to the plans that are critical to getting kids the support that they need. What about supporting the kids outside that?
Yes, so they could offer that service. It's a special ed service, psychological services. Counseling is also a special ed service that could be offered and be done by a psychologist. Most of our work in psychology, though, is evaluation, just like it is typical for the state. They do consult, though, with RTI groups. Many of our psychologists are on their school RTI team. And they're also offering consultation as needed.
So the impact, if most of the work that our psychologists are doing are the evaluations, and we're already at that 70 evaluations, and it's at that, when you met with them, it was probably it sounds like maybe January. What is so they sound very overworked. In addition to that, what's the impact on kids? Are we backlogged in the evaluations that need to be done, and how is that impacting kids' education?
Yeah, so our focus on this, of course, is to get our evaluations done. We have a timeline that we have to be in compliance with for evaluations. So from the time that we receive a consent for evaluation, we only have 45 school days to get those done. So that's a tight timeline. We are, we're within those guidelines, but yes, it is definitely a concern. And it's a look to see if we really need to have evaluations done, or do we have enough information so that we don't have to tax a psychologist with completing an evaluation, that we might have some other information that would suffice. So some of that is a decision made by the IEP team.
Okay, thank you. And then you mentioned the $1.6 million in possible Medicaid reimbursement, and I'm wondering, how do the staffing proposals that are before us today, that you've laid out, how would those affect possible Medicaid reimbursement? Would the additional staff enable us to try and get more Medicaid reimbursement? I'm just thinking about what's the net impact of these
Yes, so the $1.67 million includes, that was an estimate, thinking about some of this, but certainly not taking in all of the revenue that might be realized by this, because we really don't have an idea. But
Can you speak to which parts of this has revenue attached?
Sure.
Revenue potential attached?
yeah, so the places where there'd be revenue possibilities are within the continuum of behavioral health. So the social worker and the BHP ed tech. Also the ASD classroom, possibly, depending on the level of funding that's allowed for that classroom. That's through a funding source in Maine Care. It's Section 28, and it really does depend on the needs and the levels of the students in the program. And then in the right-size caseload areas, it would include the occupational therapist, somewhat the psychologist, and the beach ed techs.
Ms. Bondo?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. You already answered half of my question. I just have two questions. The first one is on when you talk about the psychologist, I think we just have one, and then the caseload is 1221 by 1, but you mentioned that they have some support on the social workers and then counseling. Can maybe a follow-up information later on? Can you break down, because if they have some support, can you break down the caseload for the social workers and counseling when it comes from the psychologist and bringing those supports down, so the caseload can be reduced because they get some support coming there, right?
I would say that I think my thinking on that was just to be careful of just a numbers analysis, because different schools and different districts and different states have different models of how they support students. So when that national number comes up, it's also supposing that there might be additional supports in place for students. So there might be counselors, there might be social workers or other people that might be involved in supporting students and doing things that psychologists would do, but they certainly don't take the place of what a psychologist does in terms of evaluation.
Yes, I do understand, but those kind of support and they're giving to the psychologist, do we have the caseload for each specific support than we have like on the social workers?
We can, we can get you what the caseload is for our social workers, what our caseload is for our counselors, and so on. And I do want to point out a couple of things. One, that this is a very large gap between what the recommended caseload is and our caseload, and that, having worked in a number of states, that the role that school psychologists play here is not all that different from what it is in most other places. So, and my wife happens to be a school psychologist, so I'm familiar with what the National Association recommends intimately, and the specifications for what they're supposed to do is very consistent with what we have them do. So that caseload is not extravagant, and we should think that because we have counselors that are within the guidelines, that we have social workers that are slightly better than the guidelines, that we should think that we can get by with the psychologists that we have.
Thank you. And I think the last question is, we ask some of the continuum on the adding some of the high school and the middle school for the ASD. I didn't see anything on the population today on the ratio on those categories, how many we have on the high school and how many we have on the middle school, equivalent for what we're looking for.
Are you asking for how many students we have, or
Yes.
what ratios we use?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I think, we can follow up.
Okay,
I think
please.
Deb had mentioned we have 161 students identified with ASD, and we have detail on the ratios we use to build an ASD classroom in terms of teacher to student and ed tech to student, so we can follow up and share that.
Okay, please, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Balfans, and then I have a couple.
I have a couple questions. The needs that are displayed up here, are they prioritized, starting one with the complete behavioral continuum and then going down?
No, they are not displayed with it in priority order.
Okay. And then my second question is just looking at this, is this full staffing, or going back to my last question, with before, is this full staffing or is this just a good start?
How are you?
Okay, so I would say that we absolutely, we need these positions. This would bring us to full staffing in those areas that are there. But I think a bigger question and a bigger discussion for this district is the topic of inclusion, and how do you support students in the most inclusive settings? And that does take additional staff. We have not done that work as a district overall, and we've not presented that kind of information to the board either. So I just want people to be wary of that, because it takes staff to do inclusion. And right now, we do inclusion, but we haven't done it as a system-wide focus yet.
Yeah, and that's great. I would have said the exact same thing. And then I think the other thing I would say is I definitely think this puts us a big step forward, but let's take the occupational therapist. That team came back with an analysis that was recommending more than one ad. So we're asking for one ad. I think they had 2 or 2.5. So there's some prioritization in here, but I'd say that plus the inclusion, but it definitely addresses some other areas more fully and completely, like the behavioral health continuum area.
Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all of this exciting work. I have a question on the address caseloads in targeted areas. The case manager half FTE. You mentioned 2 special educators per school. I'm imagining that's mainland schools and not including Peaks and Cliff.
We have 1 there.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure I was clear there. And then on the ASD extension, I was curious what happens now. We have an elementary program, and then it sounds like nothing in secondary level. So what happens to a student who's been receiving services in elementary school when they transition into middle school?
So each of our middle school and high schools have what we call a self-contained setting. That would be a smaller classroom of up to 15 or so students. And we've included those students when they could be included in that classroom in that setting. We've also supplied one-to-one supports for students, in terms of a one-to-one ed tech or BHP. And then we've also had to send some students out of district. So that's kind of our reality. So some students we can can serve. It's just we're not doing, we could do a better job at it. We could have, a program that was more focused on the needs of students with autism that would better serve this population.
And two just quick additions, I think we were kind of speaking to this question before, so there's the point I made about the Portland High School that we are serving, but it will go away when day treatment comes up, so that'll be a gap. And then I actually don't think we currently have that class at Lyman Morris. I think it's 2 of our 3 middle schools that we have what Deb described, but that there was a reduction at Lyman Moore in past years, so 2 of the 3 middle schools have that self-contained class.
I have just a couple of quick questions. Well, maybe not quick. Can you, and I know you guys touched on it right at the end, but the 34 students that attend private schools in Portland, can you just clarify for me what we do for those 34 students?
Sure. So we're obligated under state law to provide special education services for all of our students within our catchment area. So that includes any of our private schools that are within Portland. So we're responsible for RTI and referral, eligibility, and then we provide what we call an individual service plan for students in private schools. So for some of our younger students in private schools, we provide speech therapy. We definitely provide special ed consultation through our coordinators, are the people who are doing this service. And they're also doing the referral and the eligibility process for those students as well. It's been that way for, I think, about 10 years or so, and that was a change that, now every district is responsible for private schools within their catchment area.
Okay. Next question was of the 23%, the 200, pardon me? I'm sorry. Of the 23% of the special ed students who are ELL or English learners, my assumption is that when those referrals get made, that interpreters have to be used for the assessments. So there's that taxing involvement on multilingual department.
Yeah, I would say in Portland, we have a pretty well-developed referral process for our Ls. If a student does need interpretation, of course, we have to provide that, and we do use our interpreters for that. But we also pre-assess a student's language acquisition so that we can decide whether or not they're able to access a test in English. But certainly, there's a lot of feedback and information about, testing English learners and what that entails.
And communicating with the parents.
Yeah.
Right, of course, yeah.
And we do have interpreters at all of our meetings so that parents have interpretation for everything.
All right. Let me shoot one more, and then I'm going to bring it out to Sahar. So when we see the ratios of 67% of the students are male and 33% of them are female, any reason to assume that we're also over-referring male students the same way that we're over-referring ELL students?
I would say based on the numbers, there's probably an assumption to be made that could be true. And like I said, that's pretty much, it's in line with national trends, but definitely we are a little bit higher in our male to female data than as a district than the nation.
I guess what would be interesting is, as Carlo mentioned, that you have a percentage of the number of referrals that actually end up not being accurate, or however we want to say it. Do we see a disproportionate amount of male students that are referred that end up not being actually qualified as, or that need to have
I can answer that question, but we definitely can get back to you with the information. I don't have it with me right now.
Okay.
I think the one other thing that might be interesting, given your line of questioning, is of the males, what are the sort of highest disability categories that we see, because there's a possible connection to the work we're trying to advance around the behavioral health continuum as well.
Excellent, thank you. So again, as I said, with the LAO plan information, as it moves through the budget process, I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions to come. I do have to say before I pass it, actually no, Sahar, if you had a question, go for it. Do you need a microphone? Maybe Mr. Atkinson's microphone will help you out.
Thank you guys for your presentation. I just had a clarifying question about the address caseloads in targeted areas. I know that some of these like ed techs are going to specific places or schools. So the FLS ed techs would be going to Deering, like you guys said, with the 2 part-times going to full-time and then an added ed tech. Are all of these like teachers or ed techs going to specific schools, or are some of them being shared across all of the schools?
Great question. So the specialists, like the occupational therapists and school psychologists, would go across schools. The case manager, that would be in a particular school. So we're looking at, there's that spreadsheet I mentioned, and some schools are actually slated to lose part of a person, gain part of a person, so there's some reallocation. But to get everyone to where they need to be, we'd have to add 0.5 net across all schools. The coordinator, like we mentioned, would work across schools, and then the ed techs, like you acknowledged, on specific programs that are in specific buildings.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Victor?
I have one follow-up question / comment on the gender discrepancy. I wonder if there's any thought that there are girls who are falling through the cracks, that they're not getting identified when they should, or not getting referred when they should.
So that is a nationwide concern as well. Are we really referring female students at the same rate and identifying? And so, yeah, that is a concern.
And then my question is, I had 2 more questions, and one is, in expanding our special education staff, are there students who currently we can't serve, and so we're paying for them to be educated elsewhere, and so we'd be able to bring them into district, and have we calculated the cost savings from doing that, or not the savings, but the cost implications?
Yeah, yes, the ASD and the behavioral health continuum definitely have that edge to it. We did do that calculation last year when you approved the second beach classroom for elementary, and we based that on some of those students who were currently out of district coming back into our district, and it was indeed a cost savings for us. And plus it provided better services for our students.
Absolutely, and I hear that, and that's the central piece. But from a budget perspective, when we know we're about to enter a tough budget season, I think that analysis again would be helpful. Okay. And it's just we're then looking at the full picture of the costs that are being proposed. And then my last question is, Deb, both for you and Carlos, and thinking about the elementary school reconfiguration, would that change or add costs? It's maybe easier for me to think about in the EL perspective when we might be moving students into we're moving students into different schools and around. Are there cost implications as teachers then might have to travel more between the schools?
Why don't you start, Dawn? Yeah, I can start.
A clear opinion, but
I do have a clear opinion on this, and I've talked with special educators about this as well. So the reconfiguration from our perspective, from my perspective as the special education director, is this is a game changer for us, because it would allow our special educators to serve a population at a much smaller grade span level. So think about it, right now we're at K, or possibly in the next few years at pre-K to 5, which is a grade span of 6 levels, coming up on 7 levels if we involve pre-K as well. And when we go to pre-K to 2 or 3 to 5, we're talking about a 3-year span. And the change in special educator for us when we do reconfiguration numbers really is maybe moving some positions around. It really isn't a big add, and it definitely isn't a big loss, but we would definitely be able to serve our students better with that, with a configuration that included a smaller grade span across our elementary schools. The same thing is true for gifted and talented, by the way, because our gifted and talented would be focused in 4 schools rather than 8, which it currently is.
So I think in special ed, the perspective is that it better maximizes the resources we have, so in that way. And then
I have not had a chance to look and analyze what the elementary reconfiguration would mean for our English learners and the services that they would need. But my sense is, since that is based on ratios in large part, it would be shifting teachers from one school to another. Could cut down on some travel time. We don't have that much travel time right now for our EL teachers. So my sense is it would be net neutral.
Thank you.
So I guess we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you for the presentation. My sense is that the ask in additional staff is probably, it's a large one. I mean, so I don't want to say that it's more than we can or we'll probably be able to push forward, but my sense is that reaching these goals is going to be extremely challenging. So I think the one thing that I want us to leave with is that there are immense amounts of critical needs in our schools, and that when we hear from teachers and other staff members that they feel that they don't have the support necessary, that, you know, here it is in plain sight, and that you can see why there is such level of frustration. Because I'm assuming that this is not unique to Portland. You know, any district that's financially strapped is probably dealing with the same frustrations from their staff and their teachers, and they don't feel like they have the support. So I think that this is incredibly important that we're looking at this. I'm excited that we are going to have an opportunity to address of it, but I'm disappointed and troubled with the fact that we will more than likely not be able to meet all of these needs that are so clearly, you know, indicated in your presentation. So again, I appreciate all the work that you guys are doing. I'll let Javier finish up because.
Thank you.
No, I didn't want to
No, I meant because I didn't want to just go on here and
I just
crying.
wanted to recognize the work that Malia and Deb and Carlos and, you know, others that have been involved in building this. I think that, you know, one of the things that I'm most proud of this year is the advances that we've made in trying to be data-driven in how we go about our work. And I think this is a great example of data isn't just, you know, charts and graphs, but it's really also a methodology for looking at, you know, what are the appropriate ratios for staffing our schools. And, you know, that is something that as a small district has been very challenging for us to do. And I just want to congratulate Malia and the team, but especially Malia, because, you know, this is something that we talked about a year ago, and it's been a tremendous lift, I know, to bring it to this point. But it is incredibly important. And, you know, you're absolutely right. There is no way we're going to be able to fund even, you know, I would say a quarter of all of the things that we've talked about today. But, you know, having a methodology for being able to document why it's necessary is a tremendous step forward. And so I just, I don't want to lose the opportunity to mention that. So thank you, guys.
Yes, immense thank you. Really appreciate it. Can I say one more thing? But it's actually, I want to say something to Ms. Victor. So I just want to, because I said it to Javier when you asked the question, following up my question about the mail referrals, and then you asked the opposite side of it. So I just wanted to say that how helpful that is for me to immediately recognize the bias for which I saw that information. And so if at the very least I gained that from this tonight. Thank you.
We're a good team.
Superintendent Botana just asked me, and I'm actually really comfortable doing this, but I'll ask the board. I'm gonna ask that we skip the next board focus on educational issues, which is gonna be the overview of the school calendar changes, just so that we can get on with the rest of the agenda, and maybe revisit that at our next meeting.
And I would still ask that you approve the calendar, but what we were going to discuss in the board focus was the implementation of 4 early releases, and that, I think, is a substantive conversation. That's why we had it in the board focus. It doesn't affect the dates that are on the calendar. It will, it's something that we can deal with at a later date, so I would prefer to do that, just given that it's 8:30 and we are still in the board focus, and we have substantive issues and a workshop after the meeting, so if you don't mind. But we'll still move ahead when we get to that agenda item.
Mr. Varro?
I was just going to make a formal motion to postpone to the next meeting.
Is there a second? Mr. Atkinson, any questions on that? Seeing none, any public comment on that motion? Ms. Mariani?
So I'm a bit confused. We're supposed to vote on this, but you were just about to talk about the changes. So we're still having the vote.
That's correct.
Do we
We're
still-
still having the vote, but as part of the vote, we won't be asking you to approve the 4 early releases. We'll come back to you at a later date to do that. It doesn't change the calendar. It changes
You
the
just said
release
all that.
time
I'm
on
sorry.
4 specific days over the course of the year. And I do think that's an important conversation for us to have. And, we were prepared to have it, but I'm just concerned about the time. And so I would like to move ahead. Other districts need to know, our staff needs to know when school starts, all of that stuff, so I would like to move forward with it, but not do the other piece.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Victor?
I just have one question about that. When we do, I don't know if we do like a rollout of the calendar, but could we hold off on that until we identify those days? Because I think it's gonna be challenging to explain and to have families understand this is a new challenging addition to the schedule. And so it would be great to be able to roll it out at one time.
Yeah, we can do that.
Great. Any other questions? Seeing none, is there any public comment on the motion? Seeing none, any other board discussion? Seeing none, so all those in favor of the motion on the floor to postpone I guess it's the workshop, we'll call it, on the school calendar, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting with the majority as well. All right, moving on. Consider old business, consideration and action to approve policy DJ, purchasing. Is there a motion? And Ms. Morioni, second by Ms. Trevorrow. Superintendent, will you speak on the motion, please?
I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Townsend to talk through this. This is finishing up what we started at the last meeting.
Yes, trying to clean up our work from last time a little bit more clearly. So first, we want to start with it's the purchasing policy, DJ, and so in your packet you can see kind of the current, the draft, and the revised. So the main kind of significant change here are some new requirements regarding federally funded projects. So it has updated language, advised by our consultants at Drummond Woodsum to comply with those expectations. And there are a number of other kind of updates to conform to state statutes and city charter. So the first, for your review is the purchasing policy that, again, the most substantive change is in relationship to the requirements around federally funded projects.
Are there any questions on the motion? Seeing none, any public comment on the motion? Seeing none, any board discussion? Ms. Morioni?
I just had a question. The addition that is added to this policy around the procurement method for federally funded projects, this doesn't affect our current construction on any of the schools because they're not federally funded
funded.
projects. That's the differentiation.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other board discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of authorizing, approving policy DJ, purchasing, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting with the majority as well. Next, consideration and action to revise policy DJH, purchasing code of purchasing code of conduct. Yeah, is there a motion? Is that correct?
No, we need a motion on it.
Is there a motion? Ms. Marioni, second by Ms. Trevorrow. Mr. Towson, can you mind speaking on the motion?
Sure. Okay. And this, so this is the one that the superintendent, the question was about with the minutes, in which we're kind of collapsing what was DJR into the policy DJH. So again, you kind of have the current draft of DJR, the proposed, kind of red line versions, and then the final draft version of the new policy DJH. And the revisions here, I mean, there's a new title to the policy, the conflict of interest provisions, and specifically, a lot of new language around the disclosure requirements for a potential conflict of interest are the most substantive changes to the policy, in addition to some legal references and nomenclature changes.
Are there any questions on the motion? Seeing none, any public comment on the motion? And seeing none, any board discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of revising policy DJH, purchasing code of conduct, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting with the majority. I'm gonna take something out of order. We're gonna do the
Policy JLCD.
Yeah, policy JLCD. So consideration and action to approve revisions to policy GLCD, administering medication to students. Is there a motion? Ms. Trevorrow, second by Ms. Figdor. Superintendent or Mr. Townsend, speak to the motion,
I'm going
please.
to turn it over to Mr. Townsend, but I do want to point out that there is a typo in the agenda, and this, we just moved this forward from last meeting where it was up for first read, and this is in fact a consideration and action to approve. So this was in front of you for a first read at the last meeting, and now we are asking you to approve it. So, and I will make that correction.
So this policy, we, just for a little bit of background in terms of the proposed revisions, I pulled together and engaged with our school nursing coordinator, Tina Veyu, in addition to a number of other nurses from our system, particularly our secondary nurses, as well as a couple of our administrators to think about the implications of this policy and how it might, kind of work in practice. So they were, in addition to the proposed legal revisions from our consultants at Drummond Woodsum, they provided an additional lens in terms of feedback around this. So just a little bit of the process that we got to in terms of these proposed revisions. So this policy, as you can see, has a significant number of revisions, some of which are driven by changes in state statute, but the most significant that I would highlight for folks have to do with the following. So the most significant is the second section, which is in regards to creating policy in regards to medical marijuana and our procedures that we would follow in the event of that. So that is one of the more significant chunks. That language that we have in here adheres to kind of the state statutes in terms of expectations. So this follows exactly along with those expectations. A couple of other changes to highlight are around some different procedure and a little bit more narrow definition around the inhalers and EpiPens in terms of the self-administration there. And so clarifying the procedure for having kind of the authorization for students to self-administer those medicines. Then the last thing that was the most, was a change to highlight kind of the potential impact of is in regards to the section D, the administration of EpiPens to students without a prescription. So based on some changes in state law, in order to be able to provide, if it's deemed that a student is going into, who may not have a prescription or may not be diagnosed with a specific allergy, but based on, the informed observation of, the school nurse, there's concern that they're going into anaphylactic shock. To be able to provide that student with an EpiPen, we need to have entered into a collaborative practice agreement. So if we are going to provide that intervention, which is obviously would be considered medically necessary, right? We need to have this collaborative practice agreement. So one of the potential implications around that is that then, we need to maintain a supply of EpiPens at the schools. So currently, this is what our practice has been in terms of maintaining a supply of some of these EpiPens and having this, but this new law requires the formal entering into this agreement with a physician, and so this could be with our school physician, Dr. Patterson. But it would require us to have these available. Currently, we receive them through a program from, I believe it's BioRidge Pharma, where we get them for free, but that isn't necessarily forever ongoing. So there's, at some point in the future, undetermined, we currently get them free. And as we know, there's been publicity about the cost of EpiPens and so forth. So the Nurse Vayu, estimated that as depending on when or where this program expires, or if it does, where we get the free ones, that there's a potential cost of between $10,000 to $15,000 a year to be able to supply stock the EpiPens, because it's an annual purchase, and there's also a small nominal annual disposal cost associated with that. So those are some of the highlights of the changes.
Thank you. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, any public comment on the motion? Seeing none, any other board discussion? Mr. Burke?
Yeah, thank you. For the definition of a caregiver for medical marijuana, can you just provide that definition? Because there's another definition used in that space for those that grow the plants.
Let me find the language. So it's my understanding here that there's some particular, that there is another form that goes along with this, that in which that caregiver is identified, and they have to, produce the documentation from the state in which they're authorized, not just as a caregiver, but it's my understanding that to be a caregiver in relationship to providing care and providing medicine at schools, that there's an additional level of authorization that the state, or that they have to obtain through the state in terms of that caregiver to be able to provide medicine to a student at school.
And in that form, that's just somebody that's designated by the legal guardian, appears? Okay.
Yeah.
Why is there a need to identify topical sunscreen in a policy?
That was the result of a recent state law that called that out. So it's in response to one of the flurry of bills that were passed last session.
Okay. That's all for the moment. Thanks.
Any other board discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the revisions to policy GLCD, administering medication to students, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting in favor as well. Thank you. We're going back on, consideration and action to, we wanted to do, by the way, I didn't explain this. Yeah, so I just took that last policy that we just approved, I took it out of order so that we can do all the policies together. So the calendar we're going to get to now, which you see was kind of sandwiched in there. We also, I don't know if you were out of the room, Ms. Thompson, but we skipped the board focus on educational issues presentation on the calendar changes, and we're going to do that at another meeting so that we can discuss the additional days that are built into the calendar. But we're still going to vote to approve it now so that we can send that information over to the school so that they can do their planning and get started with that, because that's been sort of kind of like the time crunch that we've been facing. The superintendent can probably clear that up for me.
Go ahead.
So I thought that we didn't have to have the calendar technically in years past approved till April, so why do we have to approve it this evening to get it through if we don't have to have it done till April? Why can't we have the conversation about that fully? Because I was just asking Ms. Morioni, why would we vote on a calendar to say, we're going to talk about this later? I don't know if
Just to be
I'm
clear.
confused.
The only thing that we're talking about later is the addition of early releases on 4 days. And so that's the only thing. And that does not change the calendar, so we're still going to have school on those days. So the calendar that you would be asked to approve today is the one that stipulates when our first day of school is, when our last day of school, all of those other things. And then we will come back to do the early releases, just because I didn't think that, given where we are, time, and the work that still needs to be done tonight, that was a pressing issue. And while our policy says that April 1st is the deadline for doing that, that means we have one more meeting before April 1st that we could do that, which has a lot of stuff on it as well. And so, and we have, schools that want to know, is our calendar approved? Because we'd like to start planning for next year. And so I think that that's my urgency for trying to get the calendar approved, as well as, all of the other districts that are part of the PATHS system. I don't know that all of them, but many of them have already had theirs approved, so they also want to know, because this is like ultimately something that we all need to be in agreement on.
So with the caveat, we're approving it with the caveat that we're not necessarily agreeing to the extension of the days,
absolutely.
even though it's on the calendar and you're saying the teachers want to plan.
It's actually not on the calendar.
Okay.
The 4 early releases is not on the calendar.
Okay.
Part of the, my discussion today was going to be that, if you approve that, then, but I will withdraw that portion of it
Okay.
when I
Until we
tee
have
this
the
up in a
conversation.
minute. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry I was out of the room.
No, that's okay.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that, so thank you. So we need a motion. So consideration and action to approve the proposed 2020-2021 school calendar. Is there a motion? Ms. Trevorrow, second by Ms. Victor. Superintendent, do you want to speak on the motion? Thank you.
I do. So, as I mentioned, we're asking you tonight to approve the calendar. Our policy, ICA, requires the superintendent to present a school calendar to the board for approval each year, and the establishment of the calendar and the student day is a matter of educational policy. However, in consultation with staff from Portland Arts and Technology High School, PATHS, our sending district staff that included principals, operations, leadership, and the required consultation with the Portland Education Association, we're proposing the calendar that you have in front of you. This calendar includes 176 days of instruction. It reflects the fact that the state requires a minimum of 175. We have 176, which, as many of you know, is a reduction from 178 that we implemented a couple years ago. The calendar does keep 183 staff days, also as determined by contract. Two of the non-student days are used for parent conferencing outside of the normal workday. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think notable in this year's calendar is that the first day of school is proposed to be on Monday, August 31st. This will follow a week-long 4 days of teacher workshops, the week of August 24th through the 27th. And that first week, beginning August 31st, which is obviously before Labor Day, will be a 4-day week. So we will go Monday through Thursday, and then we will have a 4-day weekend of Friday combined with the Labor Day holiday. Obviously, this year, Labor Day is very late in the year, and so across the board, all of the districts in the PATHS sending area decided that we would move forward with trying to have the holiday, to have the school start before the holiday. The last day, as a result of this, is June 9th, and obviously that would need to be extended to accommodate any emergency school closings.
As we did last year, we're proposing to begin early releases the first week of school and continue through the full school year. So this is just the early release, not the early release, which we will discuss at a future date. Back on the parent conferences, as has been our practice, we allow each school to determine where their for half-day student release for parent conferences are, and that's so that they can work with our multilingual and multicultural centers so that we can have appropriate resources on hand to be able to do interpretation for families. We also need to work through that with Portland Rec, because obviously on those days they need to be available for student coverage, for student support for families. We are, I guess another notable thing in the calendar is that, as we've done for the last couple of years, there are 2 non-student, non-teacher days interspersed in the calendar, so on October 9th and on April 16th, and that is, those are days that in many other districts are professional development days for staff, so staff is there, but students aren't, and in our case, given our calendar, we don't have that, but we need to keep those as non-student attendance days, and in our case, non-teacher attendance days, so that we will be aligned with our other sending districts. Our winter break is scheduled to begin on December 22nd and returning on January 4th. And also, along with the calendar, the official calendar, you also have a draft of the Portland Adult Education calendar, and as has been our custom for the last couple of years, we also have a calendar that shows religious holidays. Just a moment to say that our existing protocols, whenever possible, we try to not schedule major classroom events or activities on those anticipated religious holidays, and when those conflicts are unavoidable, we require that students be given time to make up any work that they may have missed as a result of being out on those religious holidays. So, and with no penalties or added difficulties for students. So that's it. As I said earlier, I had a section around the early release, which I'm not going to propose because we have not had the substantive conversation, but we will be coming back to you to talk about that in the near future.
Thank you, Superintendent. Any questions on the motion? Ms. Thompson?
I was just wondering if the superintendent, on our current calendar, we have listed under Wednesday early release the Cliff Island, but we don't on the new one. And then also on the current calendar, we talk about Breathe program, 7:45 to 1:30, and there's no mention under standard hours of the Breathe program either. So I'm just wondering why those two were, they just oversights? Or?
Those are just oversights.
Okay, so there's no difference in those?
I don't know. Is there so I think that the question is, in the past, because Breathe was a one location, a day treatment program, it was, and it was separate from a school, so we had a listed time for their release. So we will add that, but the day treatment program, which is located in Lyman Moore for the K through 8 and at Portland High School, releases earlier than what those schools actually release. And the in-school programs, so those are at the same scheduled time as the school releases.
And you may have covered this, but there's a half-hour difference with PASS. Is that because of our collaborative with all the other districts, or for the early release? This year it's 8 to 10 and 11 to 1, and now it says 8 to 10:30, 11 to 1:30. So is it a half-hour difference on both sides?
I'm not sure. I have to look at that.
Okay, just curious about that as well.
I think that may have been a mistake in previous calendars because that is their scheduled times. We've not changed their times.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions? Mr. Burke and then Mr. Atkinson.
Just want to clarify that under the hours that are on this calendar, that it does not include any changes per a study on what actually meets our students' human developmental needs, right? And that's, as it states here, that can be changed at a later date.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Atkinson?
Sorry, I think I might be asking the same question. I just wanted an update on high school start times and that discussion that I think the Operations Committee has been engaging in, and just where we are in thinking about that, if at all.
We're nowhere on it. So we've not had any substantive conversations in the Operations Committee on that issue.
Okay, thank you. Just if you could indulge one curiosity, we don't add any storm days to the calendar. It seems like that's been practice. Is there thought that that's the appropriate practice, or has that been thought about? Or
I think it hasn't interfered. It's been in place for the time that I've been here. I think that changed a couple years before that. I think that it works fine. We just continue to add days to affect the required number of days.
Yep.
Instead of saying, I think people consider it confusing, like, do we need to block those out? And, we wouldn't if, in fact, we didn't have storm days, if we didn't have any snow days or, severe weather days along the way.
That sounds like a pipe dream, huh? No, I have a kid whose birthday is June 16th, so just keeps getting rolled over by the snow days. So, anyway, thank you.
I thought you were going to make a motion. Mr. Balfans?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, this is not substantive, just a correction of a typo. Looking at the calendar beginning with January, if we just correct that date in there to the year 2021, just typographical.
We will do that.
And every month thereafter, yeah. Any other questions? Seeing none, is there any public comment on the motion? Seeing none, any board discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of approving the proposed 2020-21 school calendar, please indicate. And that's unanimous with the students voting with the majority. All right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. New business. First read to approve an MOU with the Portland Police Department on school resource officers. There are no comments on first reads, but as you know, we are going to have a workshop immediately following this meeting. So next, given that it's before the hour of 10 p.m., it's 8:53. Is there any public comment on items not in this evening's agenda?
George Rowe, West Bay side. I just wanted to follow up. I had made some remarks back in February about the Foundation for Portland Public Schools. The executive director position is vacant. And as I had mentioned back then, during the election, Kathleen Snyder, it was revealed that she had a $75,000 salary that was, of course, being paid under your MOU. There was a job posting that was public. I think it was on LinkedIn. Strangely, it said something about South Portland, so I don't know if that was a mistake or whatnot. Someone miscategorized it, the heading. But basically, that listed some of the compensation details of the new candidate that presumably is in the works. And it includes medical, vision, dental insurance provided at no cost for single and adult with children coverage. Other fringe benefits include retirement plan, group life, employer-paid long-term disability, flexible spending accounts, employee assistance program, not really sure what that is, I'm not a HR expert, generous paid sick leave, unknown exactly what that means, and 4 weeks of paid vacation. So as I came maybe halfway through your meeting, but I definitely saw some of the presentations tonight. $75,000 salary plus the FICA and the other things that get paid, plus all these fringe benefits that are mentioned, I don't know, that's like maybe 3 or 4 ed techs or something, but significant amount of money. And the Foundation for Public Schools, Portland Public Schools, has not been very honest, in my view, on its website and in other communications, its 990s and whatnot, about being extremely clear that the city taxpayers are paying for all of this. And in addition, through your MOU, we're paying for office space and other kinds of utilities, whatever. I don't know exactly if you can create a market proxy for how much that office space and other those ancillary functions, conference call capability, things like that, what that all-in cost is, but this board needs to confront the fact that the efficacy of this operation, when you put in all of the upfront costs that the taxpayers are paying, I'm not sure free backpacks from LL Bean are really doing the job of getting the most bang for our buck. And a lot of what this thing does is throw parties, which again, I don't think our taxpayers need to be in over $100-something thousand for the Waynfleet crowd to be reminded that we have public schools in our community. So all of this goes away if there's like a giant philanthropic...
Are you close to wrapping up?
Yep, I'm about to. All of this goes away, of course, if there's some giant philanthropic gift in the works that's going to be sprung on us. But I think you need to do some serious looking at this as part of your budget process, so we are cutting or passing a budget in the right places. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other public comments? Seeing none, we'll close the floor to public comments. Is there a motion to adjourn the business meeting? Ms. Morioni, second by Mr. Burke. All those in favor, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students voting with the majority. We've adjourned at 8:57 p.m.